One day, a handsome young man entered a cafe called Broad Arrow, located in the historic site of Port Arthur. His long blonde hair framed his lean face. The guy surveyed the room, where several patrons were seated, then decided to go up to the second floor and settle on the balcony. He ordered a mountain of food. His appetite was heightened because he already anticipated what he would do after the abundant meal. The peculiar guest of the establishment unhurriedly emptied his plates, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and picked up the gym bag that was sitting under the table. After that, he went downstairs, found an empty table in the corner, and headed toward it. He carefully pulled out a video camera from the bag and positioned it so that most of the dining room was in view. The preparations were complete, time to begin. And the young man took out a rifle. This was 28-year-old Martin Bryant, a resident of Australia, who wanted the whole country to know about him. Martin John Bryant was born in Tasmania, Australia, on May 7, 1967. He was the firstborn to his parents, Carleen and Morris Bryant. Later, Martin got a younger sister, Lindy. The boy's childhood was quite typical, but he himself could not be called typical at all because from an early age this child was very different from others. He wasn't like everyone else. He seemed to enjoy teasing and irritating those around him, doing things that got on everyone's nerves. Martin was so bothersome that even his parents grew weary of interacting with him. When left alone, the boy would start breaking and destroying everything within his reach. At some point, his mother noticed that her son would seemingly drop out of reality, become detached and emotionless, and then suddenly return to his usual state and start pestering his younger sister. At school, Martin was extremely destructive, aggressive, and cruel, not only in his interactions with other students, but also with teachers. His parents knew their son irritated anyone who encountered him, but they couldn't do anything about it, attributing it to personality traits. At age 10, Martin was expelled from elementary school for his aggressive behavior. During a consultation with a psychologist, the boy stated that one of his entertainments was torturing animals. This greatly concerned the specialist, who advised the parents to pay special attention to their son's strange tendencies, because cruelty to animals was a troubling sign. His parents directed all their efforts toward ensuring their child would grow up to be a normal person. A year later, Martin returned to school, and although his behavior improved somewhat, he still didn't miss chances to tease younger children. He performed poorly in his studies, learning came with difficulty, so his transfer to a special education group at Newtown High School was a natural outcome. However, even there, no progress was noted. Problems with studies and behavior only continued to worsen. After struggling through several years, Martin dropped out of school. During this period, he became even more withdrawn and spent most of his time alone. Martin had absolutely no friends and rarely left home. Understanding something wasn't right with their son, his parents took him for a psychiatric consultation. The doctor examined the teenager, conducted a series of tests, and drew discouraging conclusions. In the intelligence test, Martin scored only 66 points. This was considered mental impairment. Particularly low scores were in verbal and nonverbal reasoning, as well as cognitive functions that help a person rationally understand and analyze the surrounding world, adapt to its conditions, and interact with others. Martin's mental development corresponded to that of an 11-year-old child. The psychiatrist also diagnosed Martin with autism and Asperger's syndrome. In his conclusion, the doctor noted that Martin could neither read nor write. He emphasized the importance of efforts made by his parents to prevent further deterioration of the situation. Because if they didn't intervene, didn't dedicate more time to raising and developing their son as a full-fledged member of society, he would undoubtedly face a dark future. Based on the examination results, the young man received disability benefits. His mother and father truly tried to do everything possible to ensure Martin would grow up to be a normal person. Eventually, he even developed a hobby that he tried to cultivate, and he succeeded quite well at it. The young man enjoyed working in the garden, tending to plants, mowing lawns, and he even managed to earn money doing this. In 1987, when he was 19, Martin met 54-year-old Helen Harvey, an heiress to a share in the lottery business. The woman owned a huge old mansion where she lived with her elderly mother. Helen took such a liking to the young gardener that she decided to support him and offered him to landscape her vast property. Judging by the appearance of the grounds, no one had maintained it for a long time. The entire land was overgrown with weeds, shrub branches had turned into impenetrable jungle, and some trees had simply withered. Martin had a large scope of work ahead, so the young man spent all his free time at Helen Harvey's mansion, tending to the plants. The lady of the house and the young gardener became friends. The woman often invited the youth for lunch, engaged in deep conversations with him, and shared stories about her life. Everything seemed wonderful until one day, a strange and somewhat unexpected event occurred. The health department received an anonymous call reporting the dire situation of the mansion's residents. The caller revealed that 14 dogs and more than 40 cats were living in the building with the owner and her elderly mother. They were breeding and multiplying, defecating everywhere, turning the house into an uninhabitable place. It turned out that the mansion's interior was in the same neglected state as its exterior. The health department verified the information and discovered that the unsanitary conditions in which the women lived were indeed negatively affecting their health. Both residents of the mansion were hospitalized. The sanitary inspection issued an order to immediately remove all animals. Additionally, Helen was strictly forbidden from keeping pets in the future. As any good friend would do, Martin offered to clean up the house while Helen and her mother were in the hospital. The young man assured the woman that she had nothing to worry about. He would do everything properly. His father Maurice helped put the premises in order. Together they removed piles of clutter accumulated by the owner, cleaned the walls, furniture, and windows, and eliminated traces of animal activity. Unfortunately, during her hospital stay, Helen's elderly mother tragically passed away at the age of 79. When the owner, crushed by the loss of her closest person, returned to her mansion, everything inside had changed. The huge house, once filled with living creatures, had become empty and uncomfortable. No one scurried underfoot anymore, scratched the walls, or woke her at night. Helen felt very lonely inside the empty building. For a while, she tried to accept and adapt to the silence, but fairly quickly realized she couldn't live alone. She needed some kind of company. Since her mother passed away in the hospital and Helen had no other relatives, the woman turned to her young friend Martin and suggested he move in with her at the mansion. To her surprise and delight, the young man immediately accepted the invitation and moved into the house. From that moment on, they became inseparable. Naturally, the relationship between Helen and Martin was purely platonic. They were simply good friends, brightening each other's mundane days. For the next 3 years, the mansion's owner and the gardener spent almost every day together. They would wake up closer to noon, get dressed, and go to a nice restaurant or cafe. They spent the remainder of their days wandering through shops and making various purchases. Occasionally, Helen and Martin would go on vacation, taking some cruise, and of course, all of this was at Helen's expense. The time came when Martin needed to undergo a follow-up examination for his disability benefits. The psychiatrist discovered some negative changes in the young man's behavior, and this worried him. The young man told the doctor that he had one unusual desire. He would like to shoot at living people. In his report, the psychiatrist wrote that Martin harbored aggression toward other members of society. The doctor concluded that at this point, it was unsafe to remove Martin from his parents' supervision, so living in the house with Helen wasn't the best idea right now. But the parents weren't convinced by the specialist's warnings. Their son felt quite comfortable in Helen's house. The owner had never complained about him, never accused him of aggressive behavior or anything similar. Martin's father and mother also supported his friendship with Helen because their son had no other friends. His peers didn't want to associate with him, Therefore, the Bryants decided that such a friendship couldn't cause any harm. Life in Harvey's mansion continued to follow its course. Helen was only troubled by the fact that she desperately wanted to keep animals, but legally couldn't have them in her house. The woman decided to rectify the situation by buying a new house. In 1991, she and Martin moved to a 72-acre farm called Torresville in the small town of Copping. Helen focused her attention on the farm among the animals. That's where she spent most of her time, recharging her energy. Meanwhile, Martin became fascinated with weapons. He acquired an air pistol, which he carried everywhere with him. Neighbors recalled that Martin often shot at tourists' cars when they stopped to buy apples at the highway stand. And late in the evening, the young man would wander around neighboring properties, shooting the pistol in the air to annoy local dogs and make them bark throughout the area. The childhood habit of tormenting people and provoking them manifested in his adult life as well. Although Martin didn't cause significant damage, he could very easily spoil people's mood. Martin was a very peculiar person, but he managed to lead a more or less stable life on the farm until October 20th, 1992, when he and Helen got into a car accident. Harvey was behind the wheel, Martin in the passenger seat, when suddenly their car veered into the opposite lane and collided with oncoming traffic. Both were severely injured. Martin was rushed to the hospital, where he remained for the next 7 months, recovering from serious neck and back injuries. Helen, unfortunately, wasn't as lucky and didn't survive the crash. All of Harvey's acquaintances and neighbors knew that the woman never drove faster than 40 miles per hour, because Martin had a bad habit of grabbing the steering wheel while moving and jerking it in different directions. The young man found it very amusing when Helen would panic in such moments, and he thought it was funny. They had previously been involved in 3 car accidents as a result of the young man's foolish and unsafe pranks. And now, when this information became known to the police officers, they wanted to talk with Martin. Unfortunately, Martin's interrogation yielded no results, and no arrest followed. The young man denied his involvement in the tragedy that occurred, so investigators backed off, considering the car crash an accident. Martin Bryant was named the sole beneficiary in Helen Harvey's will, as the woman had no close relatives after her mother's death, and the young man was her only friend. He inherited property worth over 550,000 Australian dollars in total. While the young man was recovering in his hospital bed, his father Maurice moved to Torresville to maintain order there. His parents understood that their son would instantly waste all the inheritance because Martin had only the vaguest understanding of financial matters. His mother, Carleen, filed for a guardianship order and received custody. Due to Martin's reduced intellectual capacity and his mental issues, it wasn't difficult at all to convince the court that this was a necessary measure, and Carleen Bryant received the ability to manage the newly acquired assets. After 7 long months in the hospital, Martin was finally discharged and returned to the Torresville farm, only to discover that all his money, including funds in the joint bank account between him and Helen, was now in his mother's name. And his father had established his own rules in the house and on the farm. On August 14, 1993, about 2 months after Martin returned from the hospital to the farmhouse, his father, Morris's friend, stopped by for a visit and found no one inside. What was strange, however, was that Morris's car was parked in the driveway, and a note saying, "Call the police," was attached to the front door of the house. The father's bewildered friend approached Morris's car and looked inside. He saw that cash bills were lying in plain sight in the cabin, and judging by their quantity, there were several $1,000s in cash. All of this was so strange that the man decided not to delay and immediately called the police. The arriving law enforcement officers searched the house and all the surrounding farm territory, but found no traces of Morris's presence. They also didn't find any leads indicating that something had happened to the man. The farm had 4 dams, and the police called in a team of divers to examine the bottom of the reservoirs. After 2 days of searching, Morris Bryant's body was found in the water at the dam located closest to the house. One of his own weights was tied around the man's neck. Detectives described his death as unnatural, and it was ultimately ruled a voluntary departure from life. After his father Martin's mysterious death, he inherited over $250,000 of his savings. He sold the farmhouse for $143,000 and moved back to the old mansion in Newtown, where he once lived with Helen. The young man himself also changed after his father's death. If previously he dressed very carelessly and most often wore white work overalls, now he completely changed his style. Martin's clothing became more eccentric. He often wore a gray linen suit, a cravat, lizard skin shoes, and a Panama hat, or a blue suit with flared trousers and a ruffled shirt. The young man carried a briefcase everywhere for added respectability. If previously Martin had been antisocial and had no friends except Helen Harvey and only irritated people with his presence, now he developed a thirst for social interaction. Martin deliberately changed his style to look fashionable and presentable, as if he had built a successful career and was now prospering. In childhood and adolescence, his peers considered him strange and avoided him or openly mocked him. Now he felt he needed to fill this void, that is, to gain recognition and earn respect. When meeting random people, Martin constantly bragged about his successful business. He hoped that this way he could interest his conversation partners, but it never went beyond brief, meaningless conversations. These acquaintances never developed into any relationships or friendships. People would just politely listen to him and go their way, secretly laughing at the eccentric young man. Then Martin became fond of one restaurant, where he would come in full dress. The establishment's staff were polite to him, but guests often made fun of the peculiar young man dressed like Austin Powers from the 60s, the hero of the namesake film. They mocked his awkwardness and unusual appearance. The restaurant owner recalled that he felt sorry for the young man because he clearly had no friends. For the next 2 years, between 93 and 95, Martin became increasingly withdrawn. When the situation worsened, he decided to use money from his inheritance to go traveling, hoping it would bring him joy like before when he wandered with Helen. Martin made 14 international solo trips, and each evoked mixed feelings in him. He hated the destinations, but adored the flights. This happened because other passengers were always seated next to him in the aircraft cabin. They couldn't simply get up and leave their seats, so they had to listen to Martin's chatter. And in those moments, the young man received the human interaction that he seemed to be lacking. The flight itself was an unforgettable vacation for him, not the place where he eventually landed. Unfortunately, these meaningless conversations couldn't satisfy what Martin wanted. Although the conversations brought more joy than money or things, they were too infrequent. By late 1995, Martin's loneliness reached its peak, and he attempted to take his own life. After the unsuccessful attempt, the young man started drinking heavily. When later asked why he had lost interest in life, what had been the cause, Martin responded that he simply felt people were against him. When he tried to be friendly toward them, they would just walk away. Martin drank daily, spending most of his time alone with his thoughts in the large, empty house. Sometimes he would go outside and try to start conversations with neighbors, but in most cases, they too avoided his company. Once Martin told a neighbor that one day he would do something and make everyone remember his name. Naturally, the neighbor paid no attention to the intoxicated owner of the mansion. However, from that very day, Martin truly began planning something that would make his name known throughout Australia. A married couple named David and Noeline Martin owned a guest house called Seascape. The Martins acquired the property that Bryant's father Morris had wanted to buy before them. At that time, the man simply didn't have enough money. While he was gathering the necessary sum, the mini-hotel was purchased by David and Noeline. Later, the man repeatedly complained to his son about missing the opportunity to improve the family's financial situation. and Martin blamed the couple who had acquired the property. He believed they intentionally wanted to harm his family. This directly led to his father taking his own life as a result of stress and distress over the lost opportunity. Martin thought this was the only cause of Morris's depression. The young man especially missed his father, with whom he had a very close emotional relationship. Besides Helen, Morris was the only person who loved the young man and accepted all his peculiarities. The man didn't avoid communicating with his son and never truly judged him for his misdeeds. Every morning, Martin would wake up, think about Morris and the married couple, the current owners of Seascape. For him, these people were directly connected to his father's sudden departure from life. And one day, Martin woke up and realized he was ready to execute his plan. It was April 28, 1996, a date that became a day of mourning for Australia. At 11:45 a.m., the young man entered the guest house called Seascape and found both owners inside. Besides them, no one else was in the hotel. Martin pulled out a gun and shot the couple several times. He didn't explain anything to them, just did what he thought was right. A moment later, Bryant heard a car pull into the yard, followed by doors slamming. He understood that he didn't need witnesses at this moment, so he composed himself, went outside, introduced himself as the owner's son, and said that the mini-hotel was temporarily closed, asking them to return later. After the tourists left, Martin found the front door keys, locked the guest house, and drove away. It all took him about an hour. Now, he was heading to his next destination. On the way, Martin noticed a young couple standing near their car. They had experienced some minor breakdown. Martin stopped his car, but not to help. He advised them to go to Port Arthur because it would be fun there soon. Port Arthur is a town in southeastern Tasmania. Its population is about 200 people. To the southeast of the town, across the strait, lies Tasman National Park. Port Arthur was known for housing a penal colony until 1877. After the closure of the penal colony, Port Arthur became a popular tourist destination. That's where Martin was heading. At the location, the young man entered a cafe called Broad Arrow, carrying a large blue sports bag on his back. He settled at a table on the balcony and ordered a large portion of food. After enjoying his meal, Martin went downstairs and surveyed the room. There weren't many visitors in the cafe. Spotting an empty table in the farthest corner, Martin headed toward it, took out a camera, pointed the lens toward the dining area, and pressed record. After this, he pulled an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle from the sports bag and, holding it against his hip, began shooting at the cafe's guests and staff. Within 15 seconds, 12 people fell dead, and another 10 were wounded. Then Martin left the cafe and crossed to the other side of the street, where he took the lives of 8 pedestrians and wounded 2 more. Throughout this ordeal, Martin remained completely calm, despite the chaos reigning around him. He unhurriedly got into his car, changed the magazine, and drove further down the streets, shooting random pedestrians from the window. When people tried to run away, Martin would give chase and still catch up with his victims. It didn't matter at all to him who was in front of him, man, woman, or minor. Martin drove 300 meters down the road and saw a woman with 2 children. He stopped and fired 2 shots. When the mother with the grandmother in her arms fell, the second girl tried to escape, but Martin easily caught up with the victim with 1 shot. Then he decided it would be good to change vehicles for disguise. He looked around and noticed a gold BMW in the parking lot. Martin wasn't bothered at all by the fact that there were 4 people inside the car. He took the lives of each one after another. After driving a short distance down the road, Martin saw a white Toyota with a man and woman inside. The shooter stopped next to the couple and, pulling out his weapon, ordered the man to get into the BMW's trunk. After the hostage followed the order, Martin slammed the lid shut and fired 2 shots into the white Toyota's windshield. The female driver died on the spot. Then Martin returned to the Seascape guest house with his hostage. He set the stolen car on fire so he wouldn't be discovered right away. The frightened man whom Martin had pulled from the BMW's trunk became even more terrified when he saw the mini hotel owners lying in pools of blood. Martin was quickly identified as the only shooting suspect. Soon he received a call from the police on his mobile phone. Despite his actions, they found him very quickly. The conversation lasted several hours until Martin's phone battery died. They offered him to surrender. They tried to find out what he wanted to achieve with his random shooting, but the young man never explained anything. The only demand he managed to voice was to be provided with a military helicopter to reach the airport, and then be given the opportunity to leave the country unhindered. Of course, the authorities had no intention of letting a criminal who had taken lives and wounded dozens of people escape. They tried to free the hostage, but Martin refused to release him. When communication was cut off, officers continued to stand outside. At that point, their main goal was to save the kidnapped man, and only then arrest the kidnapper. The police no longer had the ability to negotiate, but they were determined to rescue the hostage alive, although in reality, there was no one left to save. Martin had finished off the man immediately after talking with the police. On the next morning, 18 hours later, Martin realized he couldn't stay in this guest house forever. Then he decided to set the mini hotel on fire and escape during the chaos. The young man ran out through the back door. By that time, the fire was already rapidly spreading through the building. Martin's clothes caught fire, and he received burns to his back and buttocks. He was immediately captured and taken to the hospital for medical treatment. Enhanced security was stationed at the door of his room to prevent Martin from making another attempt to escape justice. Under strict supervision, the shooter was treated for his burns. Despite Martin's mental health issues and low intelligence level identified in previous psychiatric evaluations, he was found competent to stand trial. Initially, Martin didn't plead guilty to his actions, but Martin's sister and the court-appointed lawyer convinced the young man to accept all charges. The trial began on November 7, 1996. During his senseless shooting, this person ruthlessly sent 35 people to their deaths and wounded another 23 people. 2 weeks later, the Supreme Court judge sentenced him to 35 life sentences for each life taken, plus 1,652 years without the possibility of parole. All these sentences were to be served concurrently. Initially, Martin didn't take any of this seriously. He joked about his sentence in interviews, and it was completely obvious that the young man felt no remorse for any of his horrible acts. Martin behaved as if it was all a joke, and as if he hadn't destroyed the lives of dozens of families and taken away the future of 35 people. However, once the shooter found himself within prison walls, all his cheerfulness and carefreeness vanished. Martin very quickly came to the conclusion that he would rather die than spend the rest of his life behind bars. But the authorities were serious. They weren't going to allow him to choose an easy way out, so for the first 8 months, they kept him in a special cell with glass walls, so the inmate would be visible at all times. Then, Martin was transferred to a solitary cell and continued to be kept under individual monitoring for his own safety. The person who had taken others' lives had to fully experience all the hardships of imprisonment. Taking his own life would have freed him from punishment, however, this wasn't part of the authorities' plans. After 10 years behind bars, Martin was transferred to a new prison under the same conditions. And then, in November 2006, he was placed in a secure psychiatric hospital for inmates with severe mental disorders. Unlike prison, patients weren't locked in their rooms. They could move freely throughout the hospital grounds, while the outer perimeter was carefully controlled by armed guards. At first, Martin entertained himself by attacking other patients in the hospital, and in 2007 he got hold of a blade and tried to put an end to his joyless existence. This was his 5th attempt since being taken into custody. As in all other cases, The hospital staff intervened before he achieved success in his plan. However, just 2 days after this, he made his 6th attempt to take his own life. Martin again obtained a knife somewhere and slashed his throat. He was hospitalized and literally pulled back from death's door, after which he was transferred to the psychiatric ward of another prison. As of 2021, Martin is in a maximum security prison. His cell contains only soft objects, nothing sharp. Martin began gaining weight and losing his hair, but he continues to remain violent, both toward staff and other inmates. Recently, he broke a nurse's jaw, after which it was decided to keep him under heavy tranquilizers most of the time to reduce outbursts of anger and manifestations of violence. So now, instead of attacking people, the drugged Martin offers other inmates chocolate in exchange for intimate favors. Martin's mother, Carlene, visits her son every few weeks. She believes that if the young man hadn't lost his father, none of this would have happened. The woman has supported her son since the Port Arthur incident. Even before the trial began, Carlene tried to convince everyone that her boy couldn't have done this. She also claimed that the police had no evidence that Martin had ever been in Port Arthur. The woman probably didn't believe what she was saying herself. But in a 60-minute interview given before the trial began, she stubbornly insisted on Martin's innocence. And even despite the fact that her son had confessed to everything, Carlene tried to convince the public that the young man didn't know what he was doing, that he couldn't be taken at his word. Unlike his mother, Martin's sister, on the contrary, didn't support her brother in anything. She never doubted that he could carry out senseless shooting that affected dozens of innocent citizens. The young woman didn't want to be involved in this crime at all. She didn't want to be associated with Martin in any way, so she completely changed her name, quit her job, and moved away from home to avoid being associated with her brother's terrible legacy. The sister cut off all contacts and doesn't communicate with any of her former acquaintances. Friends, we have started a new channel and the first video has already been released on it. Please be as active as possible to support us. Thank you.